Last time and in the previous episode, we saw how British philosophy tried to rescue meaning in the modern world by engaging with figures like Hegel and thus bringing about British idealism. We saw how thinkers like Green, Bradley, and Boscanet tried to rebuild morality, society, and knowledge into a unified system. But we also saw how that system became increasingly abstract, speculative, and detached from science and ordinary experience. And we ended off somewhat with a question. What happens when a philosophical tradition loses the confidence of its own students? And we're going to get a chance to meet the students, or rather, the rebels, two young philosophers at Cambridge, G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell. We will see how their revolt contributed to what we now know as analytic philosophy. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Popular Philosophy, where in this episode, we will be discussing the two prominent figures of Cambridge's philosophy's golden age, G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell. So, Part 1, Cambridge in the Idealist World. At the end of the 19th century, Cambridge was not just a university, it was an intellectual ecosystem, a place where philosophy, politics, economics, and moral theory were deeply intertwined. And contrary to what people oftentimes assume, Cambridge was not dominated by a single school. It was a site of tension: British idealists, utilitarians, revisionists, and moral theorists. And as historian Stefan Collini explains, late Victorian philosophy at Cambridge emerged out of what he calls a common revulsion from the sensation psychology and the atomistic sociology of traditional utilitarianism. Now that's a mouthful, but in other words, many Cambridge thinkers were dissatisfied with older empiricist and utilitarian views that reduced human life to pleasure, sensation, and calculation. They wanted something richer, something that could account for moral responsibility, social unity, character, and culture. And this is why Hegelian and idealist ideas become attractive. British idealists like Bradley and Green emphasize what Collini calls the interdependence of individual and society. And this is a common theme. I didn't get a chance to discuss this too much when we talked about Adorno, but his philosophy is a site for this. I digress. These British idealists argue that a person is not an isolated atom. A human being is constituted by social relations, institutions, shared norms, and ethical life. Bradley even described the individual as a delusion of theory and insisted that a person is real only because he is social. So at Cambridge, philosophy was not just about abstract metaphysics, it was tied to questions about what kind of society could exist, what kind of citizens should be formed, what kind of moral life was possible in an industrial nation. But Collini also shows that the world was more divided than later myths suggest. Idealists were constantly debating utilitarians. Sidgwick fought with Bradley in public journals. They accused each other of dogmatism, superficiality, and confusion. There was no stable consensus. There was intellectual instability, and the young philosophers felt it. One of them, Bertrand Russell, admitted later that he had been trained or indoctrinated in Kantian and Hegelian philosophy. He studied under McTaggart, as I mentioned in the previous episode. He learned to think in terms of metaphysical systems, and his friend, G.E. Moore, was another. Both were immersed in a world of ethical theory, social philosophy, and idealist metaphysics. They were insiders before they were rebels. But over time, their suspicion and discomfort manifested in their thought. Collini notes that thinkers like Sidgwick himself admitted that philosophical work at Cambridge often solved nothing but may clear up the ideas of one or two a little. And that's revealing. Even the leading figures felt that philosophy was circling problems without resolving them. Too many abstractions, too many systems, too little clarity. So by the 1890s, Cambridge philosophy was intellectually rich, morally ambitious, politically engaged, but also unstable, fragmented, and vulnerable. This is the environment in which Moore and Russell began to rethink everything. And they were not reacting to a dead tradition, they were reacting to a powerful but fragile one. And that fragility created the space for revolt. So that leads us to part 2, More's Revolt, Reality and Common Sense. Around 1898, More begins to doubt what he is being taught. He feels that idealism rests on vague claims, on slippery concepts, on arguments that sound impressive but prove little. And this is kind of similar to what Kant was saying himself. I digress. So he begins asking simple questions. Is reality really spiritual? Are objects dependent on being perceived? Is truth mental? And in 1903, More publishes The Refutation of Idealism. In it, he attacks the core idealist claim that to be is to be perceived. He argues that consciousness always involves two distinct things: the act of awareness and the object of awareness. Seeing a tree is not the same as being a tree. Thinking about a fact is not the same as creating it. Reality exists independently of thought. And this sounds obvious, but in an idealist context, it was revolutionary. More was saying the world does not depend on our minds. Facts are not spiritual constructions. Truth is not metaphysical synthesis. It is about how things actually are. At the same time, More is working on ethics. In his Principia Ethica, he argued that good is simple and indefinable. And you should hold on to this because this is going to become important later as well in a different episode. That moral concepts cannot be reduced to psychology, biology, or metaphysics. He accused earlier philosophers of committing what he called the naturalistic fallacy, trying to explain away value. For More, philosophy should clarify concepts, not build systems, expose confusions, not replace them with grand theories. This is a new style. It is careful, precise, unspectacular, relentlessly clear. Russell was watching, and it changed him as well. And that leads us to part 3, Russell's conversion from system to analysis. Russell later wrote that More liberated him from idealism. Before More, Russell thought that philosophy had to be metaphysical. After More, he began to think it had to be exact. He began to care about facts, propositions, logical structure, not spirit, not totality, not the absolute. He abandoned monism. He embraced realism. And he began searching for the tools that would make this new philosophy precise. And in 1905, he publishes On Denoting. Now, this paper looks all technical, but it is also revolutionary. Russell shows that many philosophical problems come from the misunderstanding of language. Take the sentence, the present king of France is bald, but there is no present king of France. So is the sentence true or false? Earlier philosophers thought this revealed something deep about reality. Russell shows it is a problem of logical form. By analyzing the structure of language, the confusion disappears. This is analytic philosophy in action, not speculation, analysis, not metaphysics, but logic. Later, in the Problems of Philosophy, Russell explains his realism to a wider audience. He distinguishes between what we are directly acquainted with and what we know by description. He rebuilds epistemology without idealist metaphysics. In his lectures on logical atomism, Russell goes further. He argues that reality consists of facts and language mirrors those facts. Philosophy's job is to analyze that relationship. More had cleared the ground, and Russell had built the structure. And that leads us to part 4. A new style of philosophy emerges. By the 1910s, something new exists. Philosophy now looks different. It values clarity over synthesis, argument over narrative, logic over speculation, and analysis over system. Philosophical papers become shorter, more technical, more focused. Departments change, journals change, training changes. A new professional identity forms. This is analytic philosophy. It is not just a set of doctrines, it's a way of doing philosophy, and it spreads from Cambridge to Oxford, to Vienna, to the United States, to the English-speaking world. But something is lost. Some will say, in rejecting grand systems, analytic philosophy will in turn distance itself from history, culture, politics, and existence. While continental philosophy developing in Germany and France continues to explore these dimensions, two traditions begin drifting apart, not by accident, but some will say by design. And so, More gave philosophy a new attitude. Russell gave it a new method, but Russell knew something was missing. His logic was powerful, but incomplete. His analysis was sharp, but fragile. He needed better tools, tools that did not yet exist in Britain, and he found them in the work of the German mathematician Gottlob Frege. Frege had already revolutionized logic, redefined meaning, and rebuilt mathematics from the ground up. Russell would take those ideas and transform philosophy forever. In the next episode, we meet Frege, and we see how the logic became the foundation of analytic philosophy. Thank you all for joining me for another episode of Popular Philosophy. If you learned anything or found this episode to be insightful, please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to bringing you more content like this in the near future.